Greetings friends, my name is Pavel Stelmach and now we will dive into the top news of this day. The Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the European Union are meeting today in Luxembourg for further coordination and approval of procurement of shells for Ukraine. This work has already accelerated and the financial plan will be approved this week. At least this is what the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, hopes for. As you know, after the EU decided at first to allocate €1 billion for reimbursement of costs to EU countries that have already allocated ammunition to Ukraine from their stocks, and later to allocate another €1 billion for procurement. It is still under discussion due to disagreements among some bloc countries. The third track provides for joint procurement of ammunition.
Yes, there is some disagreement. But I'm sure everybody will understand that we are in a situation of extreme urgency. I'm sure that in the following days we will reach. But while we look for this legal agreement, don't believe that we are just sitting and waiting. The whole work is going on. The whole work is going on. So once the legal agreement will be reached, the practical work will be finished.
Borrell also said that he had a conversation with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, during which Borrell explained that there are two tracks. The first one is already working. Already, EU countries have sent requests to receive €600 million as compensation, Josep Borrell explained. I will remind you that last week Dmytro Kuleba criticized the disputes of diplomats.
The inability of the EU to implement its own decision on the joint procurement of ammunition for Ukraine is frustrating. This is a test of whether the EU has strategic autonomy in making new crucial security decisions. For Ukraine, the cost of inaction is measured in human lives. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, on Twitter.
Remarkably, the reaction to Kuleba's tweet was so sharp and public, as if Kyiv had already taken a seat at the EU table. This tweet became a rare example of loud and public criticism of the European Union by a Ukrainian high-ranking official, and this despite the fact that we are still only trying to join the EU, and now our financial and military support depends on it. We are now in desperate need of shells to hold the defense and also to prepare for a counterattack. I would like to remind you that the EU promised to provide 1 million shells by the end of this year, but according to several reports, it is unlikely to fulfill the task due to the lack of capacity at EU military facilities. However, disputes continue whether to buy ammo for us. And this despite the fact that in 2022 military spending in Europe increased by 13% more than in other regions of the world, and the total amount of military spending reached a record amount of $2.24 trillion. This is stated in a new Stockholm International Peace Research Institute report. It is believed that the war cost Russia more than it thought. Russia's military spending in 2022 increased by almost 10% to about $86.4 billion. It's third place in the world after the United States and China. As of the end of last year, Russia's spending on national defense exceeded budget plans by 34%. The main point of EU contention in the ammunition purchase talks revolves around how much to restrict the money to local manufacturers, and whether to include companies in places like the US and UK. France has been leading the charge to keep the money within the EU. The flip side, of course, is that EU manufacturers say they need the guarantee of incoming orders before they pay to build out their manufacturing capabilities. I hope that all the losses that Ukraine is currently suffering are worth your negotiations, dear politicians. Some of Ukraine's allies are considering a near-total ban on export to Russia, and among them is the USA. This was written by the Bloomberg, citing sources. Allegedly, G7 officials are discussing the idea ahead of the Leaders' Summit in Japan. The meeting is to take place in May. It is planned to involve the member states of the European Union in new export restrictions. Now, the export of any goods that are under sanctions is not allowed. If the discussed changes are adopted, then any export will be prohibited with the exception of certain goods.
This includes continuing to tighten sanctions and export controls, putting that pressure on Russia to limit its ability to wage its war, cracking down on sanctions evaders wherever they hide, rejecting Moscow's nuclear blackmail, and ensuring accountability for war crimes. The G7, from the get-go, has led the world in galvanizing and sustaining support for Ukraine. We will remind the world who is the aggressor and who is the victim, who has 20% of its land occupied by enemy forces, whose children are being disappeared, and whose civilians are being killed and left in mass graves.
But now there are many more companies that export their goods to Russia, and if they leave, then there will simply be nothing to replace a number of Russian commodity groups. After all, Russia is dependent on the supply of finished products and components from Europe. At the same time, the share of imports in everyday consumption products in Russia, clothes, shoes, household appliances, children's toys and mobile phones, has exceeded 75% over the past 5 years. The most vulnerable industry is the pharmaceutical industry. In the pharmaceutics and materials sector, the share of imports from unfriendly countries in final consumption is almost 50%. According to the Federal Customs Service, in 2021, Russia imported 13.8 billion worth of pharmaceutical products from abroad, of which almost 75% came from the EU, the US and the UK. Many medicines will be inaccessible, and their counterparts from other countries, let's say, are not sufficiently effective. The domestic pharmaceutical industry will also suffer from interruptions in the supply of intermediate products, components necessary for the production of medicines. The market for children's goods and toys will also suffer. Russians independently produce only 10% of children's toys presented on the shelves of Russian Federation. It will not be possible to increase production quickly. Both production equipment and high-quality raw materials were also mainly imported, but I am sure that the Siberian forest will be enough for the production of wooden machine guns. In fact, the Russians need to prepare for the fact that less and less modern equipment will enter the country. Already deliveries are prohibited, and those schemes that used will be closed in the near future. I hope. After all, according to the New York Times, Russia is importing Western weapons technology to circumvent sanctions. Officials noted a surge in sales of chips and other electronics components to Russia through Armenia, Kazakhstan and other countries, the newspaper writes. In particular, there is a stream of 8 especially important categories of chips that are crucial to the development of weapons, including cruise missiles. And as the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said, the next package of sanctions against the Russian Federation will be aimed at combating circumvention of existing restrictions.
The task is to remove any opportunity for Russia to circumvent sanctions. Every Russian scheme that makes it possible to bypass sanctions makes this war longer, adds opportunities for the aggressor. Accordingly, the tougher the sanctions regime against Russia, the more restrictions against the terrorist state and the all related persons against the entire Russia war economy, the faster the end of the aggression will be. And I thank everyone in the world who understands this.
By the way, in Russia there is a problem not only of technologies and materials, but also of workers. Only the construction industry lacks about 200,000 people. Mobilization makes itself felt, and there will also be fewer products for beauty salons, hair dyers, care products, etc. The problem of own production is dependence on high-quality, safe components previously supplied from Europe. Will the producers of Iran, China and India be able to replace them at a sufficiently high-quality level? Russian women will have to find out from their own experience in the near future. And then there is software and cars. All this in Russia will be in decline in the next few years, if not decades. And all this is not the intrigues of Western politicians, it's a reaction to the actions of the Kremlin, an adequate response. PMC Wagner members are the new colonizers of Africa, a proxy organization of the Russian government to rob African countries, pump out resources from there in the interests of Putin and his vertical. While Africa was undergoing decolonization, Russia was trying to establish its new colonies there. This is Putin's dangerous game, which can lead to an even worsening of the situation in Africa. Besides, the level of chauvinism in Russia is high. There is no concept of equality. Africa is used purely for political interests. They also tried to colonize Ukraine. Here, the Wagnerites wanted to seize the production and processing of gypsum, salt and other things, while in Africa they operate in regions where diamonds, gold and oil are mined.
If we are talking about the 60s, then it was hundreds a maximum. Some organized corps, there were about 40 of them. And here we are dealing with thousands of armored people who represent a fairly serious military force that can solve a lot of dirty deeds, solve dirty issues. And it seems to me that unlike traditional private military companies that are mainly engaged in security, they are now directly involved in solving political issues. That is, seizing power, maintaining power, providing assistance, and there is a huge business around all this.
Recently, Wagner PMCs have been given weapons to the Rapid Reaction Forces fighting for power in Sudan, writes CNN. Satellite imagery shows activity of Il-76 jets flying between the Wagner Group's bases on the Libyan border, where pro-Russian Libyan general Khalifa Haftar controls the territory. Sources of the publication note that Haftar supports the Rapid Reaction Forces of Sudan, although he does not take sides. According to regional and Sudanese sources, Russia transferred surface-to-air missiles to militia positions in northwest Sudan that day, CNN reported.
The Wagner Group's activities are a threat for the people in the countries where they operate and the European Union. They endanger international peace and security as they do not operate within any legal framework. The EU is determined to continue taking tangible action against breaches to international law. We stand up for human rights everywhere. Joseph Borrell, High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy.
For example, in March, the mercenaries of the Russian PMC Wagner settled in another African republic, Burkina Faso. Experts believe that they are pushing France out of there. In Burkina Faso, another influential French media was closed, and even earlier the French military left the country, who guarded the embassy and helped in the fight against radical Islamist groups. The treaty with France was broken by the military government of the country, which seized power as a result of coup d'état last year, and it also invited mercenaries from Russia to the country. At the same time, Russian diplomats started talking about opening an embassy in Burkina Faso, which hadn't been operating for 30 years now. The president of neighboring Ghana believes that companies associated with Russian mercenaries have received the right to mine gold in Burkina Faso. The founder of this Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, did not deny the information about gold. Researchers in the region claim that several hundred PMC fighters could even take part in the last coup. Prigozhin himself only welcomed this military coup d'état. In total, Wagner PMC and structures associated with Prigozhin operate in 12 countries. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia also actively sold weapons to Africa, including bypassing sanctions. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for future videos. Goodbye.